this is Rob Awahand. Today we're going to talk about the tools of critical thinking. You might be watching this for one of my classes, or you might have found this some other way. Either way, welcome, I'm glad you're here. And if you found this by a recommendation or from a search, I hope this is exactly the thing you're looking for. Critical thinking is a buzzword that we hear a lot these days. And that's great. It is important to have a lot of critical thinking in a democratic society. And if you look around right now, you see the danger of what happens if people stop thinking critically. People start to believe anybody who claims they're telling the truth. And a lot of the time, they're not giving better quality information. They're just talking louder. So how do we sort through which ideas to trust, which people to trust, and how do we test ideas to decide, is this idea strong enough to convince me? Is this idea strong enough for me to change my mind or change my behavior? And that's what critical thinking does. The problem here is that there's a little bit of confusion because critical thinking is not just one thing. Critical thinking is a set of different tools that you can use to look at an idea, to look at any idea. So when people say critical thinking as if it's one skill that you learn and then you know how to do it and that's it, that's not what it actually is. Critical thinking is a set of tools that you can use, and sometimes one tool is more useful than the other, and sometimes the other tool is more useful. Now, think about the old saying, Abraham Maslow said, I suppose it is tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. English idiom has simplified that to say, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Imagine a construction worker going around with only a hammer in their belt. The floor is dirty, clean it with a hammer. The window has a grease mark on it, clean it with a hammer. Oh, there's a nail over there, hammer it down. As you can see, there's only one type of problem you can solve with a hammer. A lot of the time, this happens in other areas of life too. If somebody's a good fighter, they might try to fix all their problems by fighting. And when someone only has one intellectual tool, when someone only has one of the critical thinking tools, they will try to use it everywhere, even in places where you need more than one tool. Now think again about that construction worker. Their hammer has a specific purpose, and their hammer also has limitations. There are types of problems a hammer can't solve. If you only have one tool, you can only solve one type of problem. If you have 3 tools, you can solve 3 types of problems, and you can combine those 3 tools to solve a whole variety of other problems too. Imagine a construction worker with 20 tools in their belt. Well, there's a huge variety of problems they can solve and things they can fix or make or build or repair if they have 20 tools in their belt. And this is also true of thinking tools. So, in this lecture, just like one tool can't fix every problem, no thinking tool can unlock every issue. And don't trust people who say one can. There are a few commenters out in the world who spend a lot of time talking about facts and logic, when those are 2 useful tools, but if you forget the other tools, things like checking sources, things like examining context, things like exploring different viewpoints, if you put too much focus just on facts and logic, you might end up in a place that isn't actually very good. Try to look for thinkers who are using a variety of tools when they think about something. Having more tools means you're ready to think critically about ideas or issues or messages in more different ways. And these days we are flooded with messages. We're flooded with ideas of what's going on. We are flooded with people telling us how the world is, what's true, what's false, what's right, what's wrong. We need these tools more than ever. As we learn these critical thinking tools, as with a construction tool, having them in your belt is good. They only become really effective if you practice using them. A construction worker doesn't pull every tool out of their belt for every job, but they do know which tool to use for which kind of job. these are not the only ones. There are lots of other critical thinking tools that you can find. Don't stop looking, because there are others. The first tool we're going to look at today is, what does quality thinking look like? Now, Richard Paul and Linda Elder studied this issue, and they say that there are 9 intellectual standards that you can find in any area of thought. Some of these appear in other parts of this presentation because they're so important. Here are the 9: clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, significance, and fairness. So let's look through each of those quickly. Clarity means, is something clear? Is it understandable? Do the explanations make sense? Do words have clear definitions that you can understand? Or are things confusing? Are there words that could be understood more than one way? Okay, that's clarity. It's not every idea is simple, but every idea can be explained clearly. Accuracy. Are the facts true? Are they correct? Are there mistakes, or are there distortions? Are they twisted? And somebody's saying, here's what the fact means, when that doesn't seem like what the fact actually means. Okay? When somebody's making mistakes, it might mean that they're careless, or it might mean that they are trying to manipulate you. Precision. How much detail are they giving? Are they saying things like, so many people think this? Or are they saying things like 85% of men and 72% of women agree, according to a 2015 study? Precision shows you that somebody has done their homework, done their research. Relevance. Does the information we're looking at fit the topic we're discussing? Does this discussion get us closer to the central question, to the key issue or the key problem? Depth. Does the person giving this message look deeply into the idea? Are they finding relationships, complexity, and connections? Are they finding the deeper, bigger ideas that the issue connects to? And another part of depth is, does the person recognize the areas they don't know? Here are the questions we don't have answers to, or here's the data we wish we had, but we don't. Okay, that's part of depth. Breadth. Breadth means looking at a variety of views. Different people, different groups have a lot of different ways of looking at things or see different sides of an issue. Is the writer that you're reading showing that they have learned what different people think about the topic? Does the writer seem willing to have their mind changed? Are they open-minded to new views? Logic. Do ideas fit together? Is evidence used properly? Do the conclusions that the person makes fit the evidence that they've given? Have they given enough evidence? Okay, significance is the next one. Significance means, is this issue important? Is there a reason to care about it? Does it matter? People who focus on the important issues instead of using unimportant issues to distract us, those are the thinkers that we should be paying attention to. Finally, fairness. When this person describing this message to you talks about other people's viewpoints, are they unbiased? Another part of fairness is making sure that we check about viewpoints that might be suppressed or ignored. There are always people in an issue who have more power, who have more ability to tell everybody their view, and there are also always people who have less power, who have trouble getting their view out in front of the cameras. A quality thinker is paying attention to who has the power and who is being ignored in order to make sure that we're looking at everyone's view, not just the view of the people who already have power. These are the 9 features of high quality thinking, and you can find them anywhere, any academic field. If you find publishing or presentations with these 9 things, you've found a quality thinker. And if you find that some of these are missing, then start to hold back some of your trust. And that will help you to recognize high quality thinking that you can maybe trust. Of course, these are things that you can look for in other people's work. They are also things that if you try to make sure that your writing, presentations, messages have these 9 features, this will make you a better writer, a better communicator, or a better thinker. Theoretical frames and logic. Now, theoretical frames are ways that a thinker has described the world in the past. The history of every academic field is full of very smart people who have tried to describe the world, who have come up with a theory or a system that they think explains everything that you see. We can't describe every one of those in this video because that would be the entire history of thought. But when you know a few theoretical frames, they can be very useful tools. So these are everywhere. Every type of writing and every academic field has a few theoretical frames that keep coming up, that people keep talking about. You're going to see some of these, and you're going to hear some of these words and terms again and again. Here are some theoretical frames you might have heard of. Things like Marxist theory. A Marxist theory is a set of theories about how the world works that were written by Karl Marx. And other writers and thinkers have followed Karl Marx and added detail or criticized his idea in order to find a better model of how economies and class work. Anytime somebody's talking about economics and class, you're probably going to hear somebody talking about Marxist theory. Okay? So if you can recognize it, that gives you another tool that helps you to understand what someone is saying. Feminist theory. Keynesian economics is a description of how global economies work that you hear again and again in economics classes and also politicians talking about economics. So if you know what Keynesian economics are, suddenly the things that certain politicians or commenters say will make a lot more sense. And also, if you've read some of the criticisms of Keynesian economics, you will know ways to answer those comments or the problems with the things they said, because somebody else has already criticized Keynesian economics, and you can find that criticism. Evolutionary psychology. Why do people behave the way they do? Is it because of the way humans evolved? Post-colonial studies, critical race theory, Kantian ethics, the clash of civilizations thesis. There are so many theoretical models or theoretical frames that try to describe the world. The more of these you've seen, the more of these you know a little about and can recognize. Once you've noticed which theoretical frames someone uses, you can connect their idea to a much bigger conversation. People have been discussing the things Marx wrote for more than 100 years. Some very smart people have said some very good, smart, interesting, or useful things about the way Marx describes economies. You can look up those criticisms and those comments, and that will add depth to your arguments as you reply. Be careful about trying to fit every single issue into the latest frame you learned. I remember when I took an economics introduction class and I learned the laws of supply and demand. For a little while, I tried to understand every single area of life that I saw through supply and demand logic. Not every part of life fits into the supply-demand system. And trying to do it requires me to kind of twist my mind around or to ignore important parts of an issue. Every theoretical model has strong points and weak points. Every one of them is a good fit for some topics and a poor fit for other topics. Be thoughtful and careful about which model you're using and whether that one is the best choice. But also keep your ear open for people who are using different theoretical models. Next, logic. Very simply, logic is the question, do these ideas fit together? Do these ideas make sense? Even a small amount of logic knowledge will help you sort through all the ideas out there in the world. But also, with logic, you can go really deep, and there's always another book to read, another way to study it. Learning some logic is really useful. Learning some common logical mistakes and learning how to avoid logical mistakes and also how to spot them in other people's speaking or writing. Those are useful tools. Remember, of course, that logic is not the only thing. It's not the only tool and not the only useful tool, but it is a very good, useful tool. Okay, there are, of course, so many places you can learn about logic, starting from a very beginner level to a very, very advanced level. There are tons of ways to learn about logic, and it is worthwhile. The next thing we're going to talk about here is fact-checking and verification. Now, logic is good and useful and important, but even perfect logic will reach the wrong conclusion if you are starting out with incorrect facts. Fact-checking and verifying whether something that somebody says is true actually is true is the next critical thinking skill we'll talk about today. Fact-checking is probably the fastest way to see if a writer deserves your trust. If somebody is giving you incorrect, inaccurate facts, don't trust them. Facts can, of course, be fabricated. Some people just make things up. They can be distorted. Sometimes somebody will give you facts that are true, but they'll tell you, here's what these facts mean, and they'll give you a meaning that doesn't fit with the actual facts. Okay, sometimes facts can be cherry-picked, and cherry-picking is when you only mention the facts that agree with your original position, your original bias. And this is surprisingly easy to do. You've got to be a little more careful now that we are flooded with information, and you can find evidence to support any position out there on the internet somewhere. Another thing that can happen is people can take facts out of context. Facts appear connected with other facts, with other ideas. And when you separate a fact that somebody has found from the other facts that they found with it, when you separate a fact that somebody has found with the methods they used, the reasons they did that study, it becomes easier and easier to manipulate facts to say anything you want. So always watch for people who tell you where their facts are from, who gathered them, maybe what university they're working for, things like that, and how, what was their method. If somebody is telling you how and where they got their facts, you can trust them more than somebody who just suddenly, unexpectedly says, oh, 85% of people in this country agree with my position. Oh, well, how did you get that fact? Where did you ask the question? What was the question exactly that you asked? Because there are ways of asking questions that have biases. If somebody says 85% of Americans agree with me, I want to know how they got that fact, what questions they asked, how many people were in the survey, and where that survey was. Okay? Because all of those things will give me clues whether those facts are accurate or twisted. Trust somebody even more if they give you access to the facts that they're reporting on. Okay, if somebody says, you know, a 2015 study of 20,000 American university students reports that 60% believe something, that's good. But what's even better is, here's a link to the report that asked 20,000 university students a set of questions. You can read the questions, you can see the data, and then you can decide whether the person writing is reporting that data accurately. If they're giving you the opportunity to check for yourself, there's no hiding manipulation if I can check for myself. Now, I said that you can take a fact out of context. I want to give a simple example of that. Okay? Now, I'm living in South Korea, and Korea opened up to foreign workers not that long ago, really. So here's an example of what happens when you take facts out of their context. And these numbers are all made up, by the way. Okay, let's imagine 1989 was when the foreign workers program started bringing foreign workers into Korea. Let's imagine that in 1989, 20 foreigners were arrested. 20 foreigners got in trouble while they were living in Korea. Then in 2020, 2,000 foreigners living and working in Korea got arrested, got into trouble. Now, some people could look at those two numbers, 20 and 2,000, and say, whoa, no, foreign crime is 100 times higher than 1989. And maybe that'll get on the front page of the web portals and everybody's going to get upset about it. But Let's add a little bit of context. And again, these numbers are all made up. This is just an example. In 1989, 2,000 foreigners lived in Korea. In 2020, 2 million foreigners lived in Korea. Instead of looking at that raw number, if you calculate the crime rate by dividing the number of crimes by the number of people, you see that the crime rate was 1% in 1989. 20 is a low number, but a higher percent of the total number of foreigners living in Korea. And in 2020, 2,000 out of 2 million is only a 0.1 crime rate. Okay, so even though the number went up, the rate went down. And just by adding these two numbers, 2,000 and 2 million, we see how you can take true facts and tell a totally different story. Sometimes the researcher's intentions are part of the context for facts they discovered. Why are they doing that study? Okay. Another thing to consider is that there are also times when disagreement from other experts is also part of the context. So consider that as well. The next critical thinking tool that I want to talk about is agenda setting and framing. Now, these are really important in the way media reports information. I want you to imagine a photographer. Okay, a photographer is trying to decide what news to report. So their first choice is, should I go to the protest? Should I go to the campaign event for the presidential candidate? Should I go to the museum opening? Or should I go to the refugee center where new refugees have arrived? Okay, by deciding which of those stories to report, we see agenda setting. Agenda setting is deciding which story is important and which story isn't. Okay, think about a newspaper editor who decides what goes on the first page of the newspaper and what goes in section D, what goes on page 1 and what goes on page 20. Okay, that is agenda setting. Just by putting something on page 1, they're telling us this is more important. Now, another thing that news agencies and media groups do, which is a little more subtle, is framing. Framing is telling us how we should feel about a story. So first, that photographer decides, should I go to the campaign event, the museum opening, or the refugee center? Then, after the reporter goes to the refugee center, they have to decide where to point their camera. What's important at that refugee center? They can point their camera at the two little boys who are fighting, or the little girls who are taking care of a baby. They can point their camera at the people who are dressed in traditional clothes from the country the refugees came from, or they can point their camera at the refugees who are wearing Western-style clothes. They can point their camera at somebody who's speaking English or somebody who's speaking the language of the country they came from. Or perhaps they can find a refugee who speaks Korean. Which one of those you put in front of the camera, which one you put on TV, influences whether people watching that news report feel like these refugees are ordinary humans who need some help, or scary foreigners who are not like us. Another example of framing is, imagine a news journal program asking the question, do vaccines work? When all of the science is on the side that, yes, vaccines work. Just by asking the question, do vaccines work? A news program is treating science as if it's equal with fake science. Because when you ask, do vaccines work? If I put somebody who thinks they work and somebody who thinks they don't on a stage together to debate, then it looks as if those are equally valid positions. But the person who says, yes, they work, has thousands of pages of research and reports supporting their view, and the person who thinks they don't work has a few YouTube videos he saw. Treating thousands of pages of academic research as equal to a few YouTube videos I saw is a unbalanced way of presenting a topic. And that's framing. Just by asking a different question, we've completely reframed this topic. Framing is very subtle. It's easy to miss the way just by choosing a headline, choosing a few word choices, or focusing on certain details instead of other details in the first paragraph of an article or the first minute of a report. Those things can really powerfully affect how people think about a topic. Okay? Think about something like the new welfare plan will cost something money, instead of the new welfare plan will help something number of people come out of poverty. Those two headlines totally change the frame of the topic. Watch also for both sides framing, especially in political reporting. Political reporters don't want to be accused of having a bias against one political party. But what happens sometimes is politicians see that even if I lie all the time, the news will still treat me as if I'm an equal candidate to the other guy who's actually trying to tell the truth. If one political party is always lying and don't care about lying, if you give that person equal balanced coverage with the person who's trying to tell the truth and trying to be accurate to the facts and to the science, is that fair? Okay, that actually puts the group who's trying to tell the truth at a disadvantage because they have to stay with the truth, but their opponent can say anything they want. And if the media doesn't punish them for lying and lying and lying, they're putting the truth at a disadvantage. And that's the danger of both sides framing. So watch for that. That is agenda setting and framing. It's a little tricky to start noticing it. Once you notice the frame, you can think about, do I accept this frame or not? So it's a very useful tool of critical thinking. Practice it, get used to it. Once you start noticing frames and agenda setting, you will notice them everywhere. We talked about what quality thinking looks like. We talked about theoretical frames, ways of explaining the world. Logic, we talked about fact-checking and the importance of verifying whether information is accurate. We talked about agenda setting and framing, which is ways that the media can present an issue to us that influences how we think about the issue. The next tool of critical thinking we're going to talk about is noticing rhetorical techniques. Rhetoric is the art of talking to an audience. It's actually a very old art. Aristotle first wrote about rhetoric. There's a lot to learn about it if you want to, if you're interested in this. But very basically, rhetoric is the art of successful communication or effective communication. If I want you to donate at the end of my talk, are you ready to donate? If I'm trying to make you laugh at the end of my talk, have you laughed? If I'm trying to persuade you to vote for me at the end of my talk, are you ready to vote for me? And that is rhetoric. Now, there are a lot of rhetorical tools. And remember that rhetoric is based on an audience. Our goal in rhetoric is to influence an audience. And remember that not every audience is an academic audience. So when we're looking at rhetoric, we're going to see some techniques that wouldn't be accepted in a group of scholars, but we see them anyway because they work for other audiences. Things like storytelling, humor. If you can make your audience laugh, they'll be more open to your message. Using facts and data, even when you're not talking to scholars, that can be a very powerful technique. Using emotional appeals, trying to make someone feel shame or guilt or pity. Logic, of course, has its place in any place where we're talking about delivering messages to an audience. Using quotations, using things like slideshows in different media, like videos and stuff. Music. Repetition is an effective rhetorical technique because it helps people remember what you said. And if you listen to really good public speakers, often they repeat a phrase over and over. These are just a few rhetorical techniques. There are many, and all of them can be used to influence an audience. Now, as you see, some of these methods are based in very academic work. Facts and data and logic, that's quite academic. And in a presentation to an academic audience, you'll see these. But a lot of the time in areas like politics or media, you will find, for example, a very good storyteller might have a lot of political success, even though they don't understand science at all. Somebody who's very humorous or charming or funny might become very influential in the media, even though they don't know much about important issues. Okay, rhetoric is not just, is this good academic work, but is this effective communication? Once you start noticing who's using emotional appeals, who's trying to manipulate their audience, rather than talking to their audience and trying to get their audience to think. Once you start noticing those kinds of rhetorical tricks, they stop working on you. And that makes it much harder for someone to manipulate your thinking. So learning a little bit about what rhetoric is and what are some of the tools people use in rhetoric will help you to be immune to manipulation by people who are maybe not good scholars, but really, really good communicators. And there are a lot of people like that, who they're just so charming you don't notice that they've thrown science out the window. They're such interesting talkers that you don't notice that they never use facts. They just tell stories, and they make you cry, and at the end of it you're ready to vote for them or send them some money. Good rhetoric is really effective, and remember that humans are not pure creatures of logic. These things work. Be ready to notice them when somebody's trying to use them on you. The next method is to look at different viewpoints. Every issue affects more than one group of people. So looking at different viewpoints is kind of asking the question, how would different groups of people view this issue? By identifying the stakeholders. Stakeholders are the people who either benefit or are harmed by something that happens, an event or a policy. Who's making money? Who's losing money? Who has the power is an important part of identifying stakeholders. Who has the power to get their message out and whose view is being ignored? Who doesn't have the ability to spread their message? Okay. Generally, the stakeholders who have the power want their view, their position, to be shared, to get on TV, to be reported in the media. But they're going to frame the issue in a way that benefits them. So it's important, especially when we find there's a group of stakeholders who doesn't have power, who doesn't have a voice, or who has trouble getting their voice heard. It's important to seek out those people, to seek out their views, and to make sure that we look at them and think about them as well. Or else we're going to just automatically accept the framing of those who have power. That's how injustice occurs, when the people who have power also get to tell the story. So go find the stakeholders who don't have a loud voice and make sure that we are listening to them as well. This is a really common critical thinking mistake. And in fact, I've found that when I see a commenter who spends a lot of time talking about facts and logic, maybe they're good at facts and logic, but looking at different viewpoints is often the weak spot. The kind of people who are too busy looking at facts often are so busy talking about their facts and how logical they are that they have stopped listening to other people and other voices. And that's a huge mistake. That's also the type of mistake that causes injustice to continue rather than helping to fight against it. So look at different viewpoints. Try to find especially the viewpoints of the people who don't have the power and don't have the voice. We're going to talk about something called the CRAAP test. Now, If you were in my class last semester, you've heard about this before. There are other videos on my YouTube channel about this that you can check, and there will be a link in the notes. But the CRAAP test was created by Sarah Blakesley and a group of librarians at California State University. When they looked around and they said, you know what? The world is full of low-quality information right now. Especially in the age of the internet, it is so easy to find information, but a lot of it is trash. So how do you separate the good stuff from the trash? And one way to do that is the CRAAP test. So the CRAAP test is for checking sources and separating the gold from the crap. CRAAP actually stands for 5 letters, 5 words: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. We can explore this in a more detail, but very basically, a currency is asking the question, is the thing I'm reading new? In a lot of areas of study, newer information is better than old, because in areas like medicine, science, and technology, technology is improving. Our tools are getting better at measuring things, and we're understanding the world more and more. So in a lot of areas, what's newer is better than older stuff. So if you have an article from 1981 and an article from 2014, use the article from 2014. That's not 100% true all of the time, and you can watch the video on my YouTube channel about currency to see what I mean by that. But in general, newer is better in most academic fields. A relevance asks the question, is the thing I'm reading a good fit for the topic I'm trying to explore? Is it at the right level? Authority is asking the question, is the person who wrote this book or this article or who made this video or this presentation, is this person an expert? What did they study when they were in their school? What school are they connected with now? Are they a university professor, or are they just some guy on YouTube? When they studied, did they study the area that they're talking about right now? Or do they have a PhD in chemistry, but they're talking about economics? Is this person an expert that I can trust in this area? What kind of experience do they have in their area? Accuracy. Is the information reliable? Are they making mistakes in their facts? Right? This goes back to earlier we talked about fact-checking, and you should also be fact-checking in the sources, checking the facts your sources are using to see if they're using sources accurately. Purpose is asking the question, why was this made? Some people write a book because they want to add to academic scholarship and they want to increase the amount of knowledge in the world. But other people write a book because they want to make money. Other people write a book because there's some political view they want to promote, and they will twist any facts and science they want to in order to make the political point they're trying to make. Why did they write this thing? Another thing for purpose is to check who's putting the money into it. Who paid to publish this book? Because sometimes once you find out who paid to publish that thing, then you can figure out what they really want and why they made it. Okay? These are methods for checking sources. This is a powerful tool because we should never automatically trust any source that we find, even if it's in a university library. And that's the CRAAP test. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about here is checking values. Values and priorities these are the ideas that give power to our opinions. Everybody has opinions, and everybody chooses their opinions based on what they think is important. Values are the big ideas behind our opinions. Things like freedom, justice, hard work, personal responsibility, compassion, order, unity. Okay, these are big ideas, and all of us think that some values are more important than others. All of us are willing to be a little flexible or sacrifice some values, but not others. In almost every important public discussion, you find conflicts between these kinds of values, where some people are saying this one should be more important, some people say this one should be more important. And once you can identify the values behind a political party's policy, it's easier to understand their thinking, and it's also easier to reply to them. Okay? Things like privacy versus safety, right? That's the real value conflict behind things like the real name internet or putting CCTVs all around the city. Okay? A conflict like transparency, right? Clear, transparent government versus efficiency. Cost versus environmental protection. How much are we willing to pay? How much are we willing to sacrifice the economy to protect our clean air? Right? Hard work versus human dignity. Okay, some people think that we should improve welfare for the sake of people's human dignity. Other people think that the value of hard work is so important that we should cut welfare so that everybody who wants money needs to work hard. Right? Freedom versus justice, morality versus privacy. Okay, these are the value conflicts behind hot political issues. Now, if you want to understand someone's opinions, figure out their values, because their values are what give power to their opinions, what make them committed to their opinions. And if you want to change someone's mind, you have to figure out their values first. Because if you're talking about a value they don't care about, you will never change their mind. I'll give you an example. I believe that welfare should be improved in pretty much every country. The reason I believe that is because I believe human dignity is a really important value. So if my friend tells me, well, increasing welfare is going to increase tax and that's bad for the economy, making an economy argument against welfare is never going to persuade me. Because I don't believe we should improve welfare to help the economy. I believe we should improve welfare to help human rights, to help justice, to help human dignity. So if my friend can find an argument against welfare that says, no, welfare is not good for human dignity, and here's why, they might change my mind. But if they argue that welfare is bad for the economy, they'll never do it. Okay? You've got to figure out someone's values before you can change their mind. We've been talking about the tools of critical thinking, and this is the final for that. Now, we've talked about how critical thinking is not just one thing, but actually a set of different skills and tools that you can use when you come across an idea. Hopefully some of these have been useful to you, or some of them have given you ways to look at a message or an idea that you haven't thought of before. The final one, and well, it's hard to say the most important one, but one that should always be in the background of all the other methods of critical thinking, is self-reflection. There are two areas of self-reflection that we're going to talk about today. One is checking for biases, and the other one is admitting knowledge and experience gaps. The fact is, when I come to an idea, I am not a pure, clean, empty piece of paper. When I come to an idea, when I read an article, just because it's me reading the article, I am bringing a whole bunch of things to it before I even start reading, because of who I am, where I was educated, the things I'm interested in, the things I know about, the life experiences I have. All of those things influence the way I think when I hear a new idea. So I need to be aware of that, and I need to know some of the unique features about how I grew up and the things I know and learned, and which of those things might give me a bias when I come across a new idea. Okay, so a big part of this is checking for biases, because everybody has blind spots. Everybody has biases that they haven't noticed about themselves. If you haven't noticed a bias in yourself, it will color every idea that comes in your head. But once you notice a bias, you can try to work against it, try to cancel it out, notice it when it starts working, in order to try and be more open-minded and to be actually unbiased. Now think about reading a new article. If I read a new article on a new topic, I might have no opinion about that topic. If I have no opinion, I'm probably going to read it with a more open mind. I might read the article and it might be an article where I read the headline and I go, I think I probably agree with this article. The studies have shown that when people are reading an article that agrees with the position they already have, people are more generous, people are forgiving of small mistakes, people are likely to think the writer of the article is smart, and people are more likely to remember that article later. Where when people read an article that doesn't agree with opinions they already have, they will be unforgiving about small mistakes. They will read it with a closed mind, and even as they read, instead of reading it with an open mind, they'll read it, and as they read, they'll be thinking of arguments against the article's positions. Okay, this is also, later, they're less likely to remember the article. They're likely to forget the article that disagrees with the position they already have. And this is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is just one of many biases pretty much all humans have. And you can go learn what some of the other ones are in order to try and clean them out of your thinking in order to be actually objective instead of thinking you're objective. Everyone is full of opinions, prejudices, biases, and personal experiences. And personal experiences are part of this too. Okay, so exploring my own biases and also exploring the way personal experiences might influence my thinking, this is an important part of being a good critical thinker. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's imagine, this isn't true, but let's imagine that I had a very difficult life when I was young with my family. Okay, maybe I lived in an unhealthy family situation. So every time in my classes, every time somebody starts talking about family and family values, that pain from my childhood makes it hard for me to join the conversation. It makes it easy for me to get angry or emotional, makes it hard for me to listen to other people, and makes it hard for me to it makes me upset when somebody disagrees with my opinions about family. Okay, all of those things are very common and easy to happen if somebody has difficult personal experiences connected to an issue. And let's remember that when we're bringing up an issue, we don't know all the people in the room, and we don't know who might have a difficult or traumatic experience connected to the issue that we're talking about. So it's good for me to consider my own life experience, and for certain issues, maybe I need to be a little more careful or prepare myself before talking about them. It's also good for us when we see somebody having a reaction like that to be considerate about that, to be thoughtful and respectful of somebody's situation. Another area of self-reflection that's important is being aware of the areas where I don't know or haven't experienced something. And I'll give you an example here. I am a white Canadian man. And because of that, racism affects my life very differently than it affects the life of my black friend. I have never felt the mix of feelings that my American black friend feels when a police car pulls them over. And I never will. So when we're talking about things like police violence, police safety, or racism, it's impossible for me to understand that experience. I can read about it, I can learn about it, I can have it in my head. But also, because it doesn't touch my own personal life, I can read about it and then close the book and stop thinking about it until I choose to open the book again. Where every time my black friend is driving and they see a police car, some of those feelings come up again. Okay, so that is a different life experience. And if I ignore my friend's life experience, I'm not being a good person. It's really important to have empathy, to think about other people's feelings, and to consider the way that an issue touches other people. And some people, now, hey, listen, it's good to be logical and it's good to be objective, but thinking that somebody doesn't have something important to say because they get emotional when they talk about it. Especially if they're getting emotional when they talk about it because this is an issue that touches their life in painful ways. Okay? Saying, oh, I don't have to listen to you because you're not objective is wrong. If you have the choice between being logical and being a caring human, choose to be a caring human. If you have a choice between making your logical point that you're very happy with and being gentle or kind, choose to be gentle or kind. And find a way of talking about the issue that doesn't cause pain. There's always a way to talk about an issue that doesn't cause pain. Find it. Now, a lot of the time, when you come into an area where I don't know or I don't have experience, where an issue hasn't touched me or harmed me, a lot of the time, the best thing to do in that situation is to listen. Listen, learn, try to understand, and now we're going back to other critical thinking tools. Try to understand other people's viewpoints. There's stuff that I will never know because of who I am, because of where I grew up and how I was educated. There's stuff that I just can't understand in the way of somebody who grew up in a different place, in a different life situation, who has different life experiences. So knowing which areas I know about and which areas I don't, and knowing when to stop talking and say, you know what, I'm not the expert here, I'm going to listen. That is a critical thinking tool that will make you a better participant in conversations about difficult issues, especially difficult issues that are hurting some people in our society. So remember that. Remember what you know and where your knowledge ends. Remember which strong points you have, which things you know a lot about, which things you can talk about with some authority, and also which areas you don't have experience, you don't know much about, you don't have authority. And in those areas, step back. Step back and give the microphone to somebody else. Okay? Or step back and educate yourself. Go find those different viewpoints, because every group of people who's different than me have somebody on YouTube explaining what their life is like. And I can go find that. I can go find their Twitter or their TikTok or their YouTube or their academic articles and actually learn what it's like to be somebody other than myself, instead of talking when I have no authority. Okay? That is the importance of self-reflection. Self-reflection helps me to give more respect to other people in the conversation. So now we have looked at a big variety of tools of critical thinking. We've talked about what quality thinking looks like. We've talked about the fact there are a lot of theoretical frames, and if you can identify them, you can connect an issue to a much bigger conversation, which helps with understanding. We've talked about how logic, even a little logic, is helpful, but the more logic you learn, the more useful that tool is. We've talked about how important it is to check facts and make sure that things are being reported correctly, and that we shouldn't trust sources that don't tell us where they got their facts. We've talked about agenda setting and framing, which are ways that media and other influencers can influence the way we think about a topic or which topics we think are important. We've talked a little about rhetorical techniques, which can be used for more effective communication, but they can also be used to manipulate people. We've talked about why it's important to look at different viewpoints and understand how different people who are different than us see the world, as well as trying to find when there's an issue, who are the stakeholders and which of those stakeholders are getting their story heard and which ones aren't. We talked about the CRAAP test for checking sources and deciding which sources to trust. We talked about the importance of trying to notice which values are beneath the ideas in a discussion, because once we figure out what values someone cares about, we can understand their thinking a lot better and we can find a better response to them. And finally, we've talked about why self-reflection, self-knowledge, understanding who we are, what we know, and what we don't know is another key to being a respectful and helpful part of a difficult conversation where some issues hit other people's lives differently than they hit our lives, and that can have an impact on them, and we need to honor that and respect that. Thank you for staying with me through this entire series. Have a wonderful day. I hope this has been a useful set of videos for you to watch, and I'll see you again either in class or in another video. Bye now.